Thank you for all your questions. Lots of questions. Some of the questions are kind of in the similar sort of vein, so we're going to sort of try and sort of pick one that we think sort of covers that. I apologise in advance. There's some questions we won't be answering because some of them are just kind of a little bit left field. So,
there was that one about Essex, wasn't there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why Essex?
Yeah.
I mean, in answer to that question, why not Essex?
That's it. No, you convinced me, Phil.
There was a question about the coffee, incidentally.
Oh, there was, wasn't there?
Yeah, someone asked about a question about what evidence is our coffee better than Costa? Which, that's a fair question.
That's a fair question.
Yeah? And my response to that is, come on, it is free, where Costa will charge you.
And Costa's shut, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're not open there anyway.
Yeah, better latte than never. That's what I say.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, that's how this session's going to go. Anyway. So we do appreciate the questions. Thank you for them.
Puns, I think.
Yeah. So we've got a number of questions. So thank you for those.
Good.
We want to kind of deal with a number of different things, and we'll see where we go throughout the rest of our time together. So. Kind of coming off the back of your talk, really, and sort of looking at the whole issue of, I guess in many ways, this issue of evil and things like that. So one of the questions was, why does God allow cruel, evil men like Hitler, Putin, etc., and so on, and there's plenty of those throughout the centuries and throughout the years.
Yep.
Why does he allow that to happen, to persecute, to kill, to torture innocent people?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, isn't it? And one of the things I find interesting, though, when you start thinking about it, it is a really good question. But immediately you begin interrogating the question slightly, Phil, you run into a couple of things that interest me. The first thing is, it kind of does assume that we can make a differentiation. We can distinguish between, Putin and Stalin and, all the nasty types and ourselves. We do rather have a tendency to draw a little circle around us and go, well, we're okay if only everybody were like us. But what if that's not the case? What if actually all of us can be relatively monstrous? It's just opportunity that we lack. One of the most influential writers of the 20th century was a Russian writer called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was imprisoned by Stalin for his political views, spent a long time in the Soviet labor camps, became a Christian actually in the camps, and when he was released wrote a best-selling book. Some have argued it's the most influential political book of the 20th century. Reflecting on his experiences. There's a little paragraph where he reflects on the nature of evil. And it'd be very easy for Solzhenitsyn to go, the problem is the Soviets, problem is communism. He doesn't. What he says is this. He says that the dividing line between good and evil runs not between political ideologies or between states or between classes even, but the line dividing good and evil runs right through the middle of every human heart. And his point was, I began to realize the only difference between me and the SS officer, the guard who was persecuting me, was he'd had the opportunity and I hadn't. But actually inside my heart, it was probably just as messy as his was. So that's the first question. If that is true, that we are all a little bit messed up, then an interesting question follows. What if the answer is yes, God could have constructed a world without evil and injustice and pain and suffering, but it would have been a world without you and I in it? Because I would say the big question the Bible wrestles with is, how can God create a world where we have freedom, we are free to love, and because we have that freedom, we're also free to do the other, but nevertheless, we still have existence, because God could easily have created that perfect world without us in it. And the whole story of the Bible, and especially the story of what Jesus does, is all about how God squares that circle. So I think part of the answer to the reason there's evil and suffering in the world is if there wasn't that allowed, you and I wouldn't be here. But thankfully, miraculously through Jesus, God doesn't look at us and condemn us and go, that's it, there is no way back. But actually to each one of us offers the chance to, if you bow the knee and say, Jesus is Lord and I am not, and I realize I'm a messed up, broken individual who needs God's radical forgiveness, then God offers to meet us and put our hearts right, whether we have been incredibly monstrous or just like most of us, hopefully in this room, slightly monstrous.
So, but that leads on to kind of this next question, which I guess kind of ties in with that, because people can look at the world, they can see that there is suffering, they can see that there are bad things that happen, and some might even say to good people, innocent people and all that. I know you've kind of just touched on that. So then people then start thinking, well then, how is it possible that a God can exist.
Yeah.
And the question I've got is, how do you know that God exists? And that's always a challenge for me when you look at the world and you think, well, God couldn't exist if this stuff happens. So what is, I suppose the question really is well, how do we know God exists? What are some of the evidence, I guess, for God's existence?
Well, I'll answer the evidence question just a moment, Phil. That's a brilliant question. Thank you, whoever asked that. But that suffering question, the thing I find fascinating about the suffering question, it's a tough one for everybody. As Christians, we need to wrestle it through. The challenge is, how as Christians do we reconcile suffering and evil in the world with God? If you are an atheist, the challenge is, how can you use the words good and evil and suffering in the first place? Because what gives you the right to point to Vladimir Putin and say that's wrong, that's evil, that's unjust? Who died and made you God? At the end of the day, Putin could simply turn around and go, well, I'm just a collection of atoms in motion, I can do exactly what I like. And one of the most influential atheists of the last couple of hundred years, a guy called Friedrich Nietzsche, radical atheist, famously said that if there is no God, then we have removed, as it were, the horizon. There is no up, no down, no left, no right, no good, no evil. All there is the will to power. So the powerful get to make what is right, and the weak just get to suck it up. And so the problem you then have as an atheist is, but that's not good enough. I want to look at injustice and say it's wrong. I want to look at suffering and say that's not right. How can I do that? And I always say to my skeptical friends, the thing is, if you remove God from the picture, you don't solve the problem of evil and suffering. You just make it impossible to talk about it. That's the first thing. In terms of evidences for God, I reckon if we had a couple of hours, Phil, I have about 30 or 40. We don't, so I won't. But I would suggest let me suggest three categories of evidence we have for God. Firstly, I'd say there's evidence from science, funnily enough. I think one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for God's existence from the arena of things like science is the fact that there is something rather than nothing. The universe that we live in is not eternal. It was not always here. It had some kind of beginning, whether you want to label that the Big Bang or whatever. And something does not come from nothing. That is why however long you look at your online bank account wishing £1 million would appear in it overnight, it will not happen. However long you look at your empty plate wishing another piece of cake would materialise, that ain't going to happen unless you do something. Something does not come from nothing, and the same applies to universes. So this universe that we live in, we need a cause outside of space and outside of time. And you end up with something looking rather like God, even if you choose to avoid that word. So there's evidence from science, and there's a whole basket of evidences like that. Then we come, Phil, to the moral sense that you've talked about. Isn't it interesting that we all have this deeply wired sense that justice is real? Nobody sat there during COVID and responded by saying, hey, isn't it wonderful? COVID is on an evolutionary perspective, is brilliant. It's thinning the herd. It's killing the weak. It's killing the elderly. It's making humanity stronger. Hopefully nobody in this room reacted that way, and hopefully you don't know anyone who reacted that way. This is not the local branch meeting of Sociopaths Anonymous. But the fact that we instinctively don't respond that way tells me that we are wired to recognize that human beings have value and dignity and worth. That's why we care about things like human rights and dignity and so on. That is very hard to explain those things unless we have some kind of source outside of ourselves as that great value giver. And again, there's a whole set of arguments connected with that, actually, if we had more time this evening. And then lastly, there's the question of Jesus himself, his life, his death, his resurrection. I think the historical evidence for the resurrection is overwhelmingly good. I know there's a question coming up in there on that very question. So I would say there are arguments from history that we might look at the life and the death, the claims that Jesus made about himself, and the way that I think the resurrection validates those claims. So from science through to that very experience of what it means to be human and everything that comes with that, through to arguments from history. And if we had time, there's about 30 or 40 arguments I might give you. There are some great books, by the way, at the back on this subject. If you're someone who that question interests and you'd like to go deeper, do take a look. But there is, I think, overwhelmingly strong evidence, far more so than the alternative, the idea that we just live in a godless, materialistic universe with atoms and particles cuddling together for warmth.
So I suppose the other question I've got here, but I'll just kind of move us into it a little bit, is thinking about this idea. So you've got people who's someone who's genuinely checking out the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And maybe they've got Christian friends and they're looking at it and they're looking at their Christian friends and they're looking at the Christian faith, they're weighing it up, they're kind of walking around it, they're kicking the tires, they're kind of thinking, is this something that I should really go further with? And they may believe that there is God, they may even believe that Jesus exists and all those kind of things, but they're not at that point of taking that step because they've looked at kind of their Christian friends and they see that for them, life is tough for them.
Yes.
And there's a question here that says, there's a sentence that says, Jesus says, life to the full, I
Yeah.
can't give you life in abundance, and all that, I guess, is what they're thinking of. And the question is, I question this when friends with real faith are living a life of illness and pain, but still continually pray for healing. And yet their lives are not living life to the full. Now, I realise that's a judgment that someone's making, because actually someone might have a Christian may have a completely different view. But how do you square that away when Jesus says, I come to give you life in all its fullness, and yet for some Christians, it doesn't look that way on the outside?
Well, the interesting thing with that question, and again, whoever asked it, thank you, that's a phenomenally good question. Of course, that's not a new question. You know, that little bit of the Bible I read to you this evening from 1 Peter, in a sense, is wrestling with that. Peter is writing to people who are going to get killed for their faith. He's writing to people who are being arrested and rounded up and harassed and persecuted and threatened, and many ended up dead for their faith in Jesus. Christians have lived through earthquakes and pain and pandemics and wars for 2,000 years. In fact, the Christian faith has been battle-tested. And so the fact that there is suffering, and that suffering still strikes, even if you believe in God, is not news to Christians. The question I think that Christianity helps you with is far more the question of, how do I live with suffering? I do believe that God sometimes intervenes dramatically. I've seen that. I've seen that in the lives of friends. But he doesn't always. Being a Christian does not make you immune from suffering. But what I think it does do is it changes your perspective on suffering. Because that thing about life to the full is interesting, Phil. If there is no God, what does life to the full look like? Well, I guess it looks like having a nice job, a nice car, having an occasional holiday, good health, all those things. And I think the reason that the pandemic caused such a crisis for so many people is it kicked all those things away when it came. Suddenly we couldn't go to our workplaces, we couldn't see our friends, we couldn't have the nice holiday in France, we couldn't do the things that for many in our society made life worth living. And it suddenly exposed that the kind of hopes that many of us have placed our hearts in don't really work. So that raises the question, what does life to the full look like? And I think as a Christian, I would say life to the full looks like having a relationship of intimacy with the God who created you. Being a Christian is not just signing up to some set of beliefs and going, okay, great, I recognize there's a God up here, okay, I'll add that to the things I believe in. But God offers us this radical offer of adoption into his family and becoming quite literally his sons and daughters and entering into relationship with him. And I believe that's what life is designed to be. And if that is true, that means if life is wonderful and everything's going great materially, fantastic, you can rejoice. If life is going terribly and every outside conceivable metric you should be miserable as hell, it enables you to go, no, life is still tough, but I can still have joy. And you know, Phil, one of the most moving things in my life was I remember in my early 30s, traveling to India for the first time and meeting there followers of Jesus, Christians who were absolutely dirt poor, experiencing some of the toughest conditions you might possibly imagine, but some of the most joy-filled people I have ever met. And it was a real challenge to me as a Westerner who would occasionally complain about things like, oh, you know, the car MOT was a bit more expensive this year. Here are people who life was really awful, but this joy came out because they got it right. So I think the question for all of us is, what does it mean to have life to the full? What is that like? And where does God fit into that story?
So coming off of that, really, again, tying in with some of the things that you quoted C.S. Lewis a couple of times. So the question is, how do you persuade people that God/hope isn't just another C.S. Lewis distraction?
Yeah, what a brilliant question. Thank you. So someone was taking notes, right? Of going,
it's good. Someone listened.
Someone listened. Yeah, one person. That's always a success.
I'll take that. Yeah,
I'll take that to the bank. I think what I'd simply say is going, if the Christian story isn't true, then faith in God is just another distraction. And that's the best that you've got. Everything is a distraction. And really, the challenge, I think, this evening, that I laid it on the line at the end with my reference to sitting on barbed wire fences, is I think there are only really two consistent positions you can adopt as a human being. You can either just say life is absurd and it's meaningless and it's depressing and it's just awful. And yes, I recognize that, but I'm just going to try and grip my teeth and get on with it. You're like the Indian on the raft. I can at least respect that. Or you can say, I don't think material things are all they are, and I'm going to give Christianity a really good look. I'm going to walk around and kick the tires, and I'm actually going to try putting my trust in Jesus and see what happens. Either of those positions I can respect. The one I can't respect is the kind of whistle in the wind and go, it's all okay, don't look, nothing to see here, move along. That, I think, is foolishness. So yeah, if we do live in that godless universe, then it is a distraction. but distraction's the best that we have. The question you have to ask is there more than that?
So let's talk about then the resurrection, the virgin birth, because these are this is a question here, but these are the things that some people will struggle with because, I mean, you can believe in a God. The God could be who you want to make it is. It may not be necessarily the God of the Bible. It could just be the God that you make up. I get that. Where it gets to kind of really sort of splitting it out is who you think Jesus is.
Yeah.
And it's the birth.
Yep.
The virgin birth, and which some will struggle with, just think that's a bit of a fairy story perhaps, so how do we know that's true? But then the other one, and they might think it's true because it's great for Christmas, but what about the resurrection then? Because again, how does that tie in with kind of evidence in the fact of, isn't that just a made-up story that's helped the church to be what it is?
Oh, I love that. I love that last question. In one sense, actually, Phil, the last question answers the first, because if the resurrection happened, you could argue the virgin birth is a drop in the bucket comparatively. And also, if you believe in a God who creates life in the first place, creating life with only one half of a human parenting couple involved, it's not actually that difficult. But the resurrection, on the other hand. Now, here's the interesting thing. Many people are not aware that a lot of secular historians take the resurrection stories very, very, very seriously. I remember doing a debate at St Andrews University just before COVID with an atheist historian on did the resurrection happen? And every quote I used that evening was from secular scholars who often fell short of going, well, I think it happened, but would end up going, well, something happened, something quite dramatic, but we're not willing to say what. Why do they say this? Well, very quickly, there are 5 basic facts that are agreed upon by virtually every historian working on the first century, be they Christian, Jewish, or secular. And the 5 facts are quickly these: that Jesus was killed on a Roman cross. That is, as one secular historian put it, one of the most certain facts of first century history. Why? Because it was embarrassing. The first Christians were Jewish. They claimed Jesus was the Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to defeat the Romans, not get nailed to a bit of wood by them. And in fact, you can find pagan writers at the time insulting Christians for believing in a crucified Messiah, and Jews thought the idea was ludicrous. It was a deeply, deeply problematic idea. It would have been much easier had the first Christians not had to deal with that. So the resurrection is so difficult for the early, the crucifixion is so difficult for the early church. Any historian you read on the subject will say it's categorically happens. Furthermore, we also don't just know of it from the Gospels and the Bible. It's mentioned in Jewish historians like Josephus, Roman historians like Tacitus. So we can be sure that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. And by the way, the Romans jolly well knew how to kill people. Secondly, the empty tomb is taken as a given by historians of all stripes. Why? Well, again, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a ridiculous story to invent, given that the resurrection is supposed to have happened in Jerusalem. You know, if you are saying the tomb is empty, he's risen from the dead, while literally 2 blocks down the street there is a tomb with a body in it, that idea is not going to get off the ground, because people just have to go and check. So the fact that Christianity starts in Jerusalem, where the empty tomb was, is pretty compelling evidence. And then secondly, what gets historians excited, if you read the gospel accounts, it is women who discover the empty tomb. Women were not considered good witnesses in the first century Greco-Roman world. If you were making those stories up, you would have picked good male Jewish and secular witnesses. You'd have picked people like like Peter, James, and John, not a bunch of frightened women. And by the way, we read in the Gospels that the male disciples did not believe the women at first because they thought they were just frightened women. Thirdly, resurrection appearances. They are so many of them and so diverse in groups ranging from 2 to 500 in different settings. There is no real explanation we have other than the disciples actually saw something. Visions don't really count it. Hallucinations don't really work. There's no such thing as a mass hallucination. We don't know any examples in history. And then, by the way, if you discount the resurrection appearances, you have no explanation for what changes the disciples from a bunch of frightened men and women hiding out from the authorities to the most self-confident missionary society in world history. Those, by the words, are the words of a Jewish historian, Pinchas Lapide, who said, if you remove the resurrection appearances, we have no way to explain what transformed the disciples. Fourthly, you have the appearance of the conversion of skeptics, someone like Paul, who writes half the New Testament. He was a persecutor of the early church. He was a very, very fundamentalist Jew, hated the early church, encounters the resurrected Jesus, turns his life upside down. And then we have James, the brother of Jesus. You would think you would know if your own brother had risen from the dead. If you read the Gospels, you see that early on in Jesus' public ministry, James is a bit of a skeptic. He thinks his brother is probably, a couple of prawn crackers short of a Chinese meal. Something transforms him into a believer, and he goes on to be the founder of the Jerusalem church, gets martyred for his faith in the resurrection, as did many of the early witnesses of the resurrection. And as one historian pointed out, liars make bad martyrs. And then lastly, fifth final point for you, most of the first Christians were Jewish. They had a perfectly good faith that had functioned wonderfully for 2,000 odd years. They were deeply proud of it. Something caused them to turn their entire religious belief system upside down all around the resurrection. It's like somebody once said, it's like a resurrection-shaped bomb went off in first century history. And if it wasn't the resurrection of Jesus, you have no way of explaining what transforms Judaism into Christianity. Put those 5 facts together, and I would say the bodily resurrection of Jesus is far and away the best explanation for all of them.
Brilliant. And it's interesting, there's a couple of quite well-known books, I guess, that were written, wasn't there? One many years back in the 60s and one more recently about trying to disprove the resurrection. There was a kind of a historian and a journalist kind of just went out to try and say, well, this is no nonsense, I'm going to prove that it's wrong. And ultimately found out there was too much evidence, and ultimately realised that they needed to commit their life to Christ, and that's what they did.
That's Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison.
Yeah, and The Case for Christ is another one that's
by Lee Strobel,
which are really worth, certainly The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith. He's written a number of different things, and he was someone who was an atheist, didn't believe in God, and his wife became a Christian, and he thought, right, I'm going to disprove it, and looked at all the evidence and found that the evidence was overwhelming. So we don't have that book, unfortunately, but if you want it, we'll get hold of it for you. So
there's an offer.
Yeah. I charged £20 for it. No, not really. We'd have to give it to you.
You can take the man out of Essex, but you can't.
Listen. Yeah, and I used to be an estate agent before I was a pastor, so, that's...
and I'm married to an Essex girl, by the way, hence why I can take the occasional pot shot at her county.
What a blessing that must be for you, being married to an Essex girl.
Absolutely, just in case she's...
Very careful what you say there.
So you never know what's been recorded.
So, what about this one? This is a good question. So what should be our approach to cheerful atheists like Professor Dawkins, who states, there is probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life?
Oh, do you know, that's interesting. You mentioned the good Professor Dawkins. That quote, there's probably no God, stop worrying, enjoy your life. That was the slogan he and other atheists paid to slap on the side of buses.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah, that's in London, wasn't it?
I remember when I first came across that, back in 2012 when that kicked off, I think. I remember a friend ringing me up and saying, you've got to come down to London. There are atheist buses here. I remember saying to my mate, how do you tell if a bus is an atheist or not? Is it just, I don't know. And quite frankly, the driving of many London bus drivers has moved many people closer to God, not further away. But what was interesting, many critics of that statement, including actually many secular critics, picked up on something interesting. There are 2 problems with that statement. The first is, well, if there is no God, actually maybe that's a cause for worry, not a cause not for it. Some of the quotes I gave you this evening from secular thinkers, someone like Bertrand Russell, if he were around today, would say, actually, Richard, I think that's a cause for worry. Albert Camus, my friends who said atheism was long, cold, hard, dark business. I've had many atheist friends over the years who've said to me things like, I wish there were a God, actually. So I think it's all right if you're living in the sort of wonderful environs of North Oxford, having lovely dinners at the university, to say, oh, just no need to worry, there's no God, don't worry. But then the second problem someone pointed out with Richard is just stop worrying and enjoy your life. Well, hang on a minute, why enjoyment? I mean, aren't there a whole range of other emotions in life? What about joy, happiness, self-sacrifice, courage? I mean, there's a whole range of human emotions. Why settle on only the word enjoy? I mean, some might say enjoyment, it's looking to just purely enjoy life. That's probably what animals do, really, food and sex. But, that's part of being human, but very narrow sliver. And then, frankly, as well, what do we say to Dawkins if you are someone who's suffering? What if you're someone who's living in Ukraine right now? Is that his message to the Ukrainians in their bombed-out cities? Don't worry, there's no God, just enjoy life, guys. It doesn't really fly at all. Again, it looks a very sort of sheltered view of the world. So the first thing I would say to someone like Dawkins, we could push back and go, Richard, come on, really? And interestingly, his fellow atheist, Richard was one of a group of atheists known as the New Atheists, who popularised atheism again in the sort of 2000s. One of his fellow travellers was a guy called Christopher Hitchens, and Chris died a few years ago from cancer. And it's a shame because actually he was a much more interesting atheist, and towards the end of his life, he was not beyond criticizing Dawkins and saying Dawkins has a very fluffy view of the world, but actually, as someone who's a journalist who's been to war zones, I don't think life is that simple. So I think it's a very simple, very naive form of atheism. But one last thought for you. Tomorrow, for those of you who are coming to the conference, and if you're not, this is your reason to come. As well as me and my terrible humour, we have two other speakers, Sharon Dirks from Oxford, and then from up in Guildford, we have Justin Brierley. And Justin's a radio presenter and broadcaster who's got a new book coming out in September called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And that book is looking at the growing number of public intellectuals, writers, journalists, broadcasters, and others who are actually now swinging back the other way and saying, actually, we need God. And it looks as if Christian faith actually really might be significant. There's a whole range of people in that conversation. So I think Dawkins is slightly dated now, actually. I think the conversation has moved on. And Justin will be speaking on that topic tomorrow. So if you want to come and hear more about that. And he's also interviewed Richard Dawkins as well. So if you ever asked that question, if you want to talk to someone who has actually spoken to Richard, come and nobble Justin tomorrow. Ask him for a free copy of his book. I'm sure he'll give you one. Tell him if not, Phil will pay for it.
So let's move on into the scale to the other, because again, when people are thinking about Christianity, and they then start looking at other religions as well, and that's a fair question. And this question says, what makes Christianity the answer when there are many religions to choose from? And does it matter, so as long as we're trying our best to live a good life? So there's kind of two there, aren't there, I guess?
Well, the first thing I guess I'd challenge is firstly whether we are all just trying to live a good life. Is that really what life is all about? That's the first question. Is it just purely morality? If it is, of course, who decides? We keep coming back to this question. If you want to use words like good and evil, Phil, who gets to decide? Yeah. And the challenge, I think, for many of us attempted to decide that for ourselves. But deciding good and evil for yourself is tantamount to my firing an arrow at a barn door from 50 yards away, going up and then drawing the target around where I hit and went, look, I'm a world-class archer. Any one of us can be a good person if we get to decide what good is. That's the first observation. Second question I would say is I'm not sure whether Christianity is primarily about being a good person. Jesus said some things about being good, but he said a whole range of other things as well. I think at the heart of the Christian faith actually is the recognition that you can't be a good person, and that actually what you want is not advice, but rescue. And that's the thing that sets Christianity apart. You see, every other religion in the world, and by the way, I do speak as someone who comparative religion is kind of my thing. I actually have a PhD for my troubles, and it's in Islamic studies, not biblical studies. So I've spent 25 years studying Islam academically as well as my own faith. It's been observed that all the other world's religions, Phil, you can divide into one of three categories. They're either based on knowledge. So Buddhism, case in point, you're saved by what you know. You have to master the right set of truths, and if you master those truths, then you can arrive at, well, not quite heaven, but, sort of nirvana or wherever you're looking for. Other religions are based on experience. If you have the right mystical experience, meditate hard enough, do enough yoga while standing on your head on a raft or something, then you can arrive at a higher state of existence. And then you have religions that are based on doing, like Islam. Here are some commandments. Keep them, earn enough points. If you earn enough points, then maybe you'll go upstairs rather than the other place. So knowledge, experience, or action. Along comes Jesus and turns that on its head. Because Jesus, I think, would say the problem with all of those three things, it makes it about me. It's about my knowledge, my experiencing, my doing. And the danger is it can lead to self-righteousness, it can lead to pride and smugness. Because if I think I know more than this guy, or I've had a better experience than this guy, or I've done more than this guy, I'm going to look down on Phil. And that's just arrogant. Jesus, on the other hand, turned that around. It's not to do with your thinking, feeling, or doing. It's actually about relationship and entering into a relationship through me, with the God who created you. So I think that's what makes Christianity unique, and Jesus stands at the heart of that uniqueness. And the question, I think, for us isn't, is Christianity just randomly true among all the other world's faith traditions? The question is, do the claims that Jesus make stand up? If you're not aware of them, grab hold of a copy of one of the Gospels, the 4 historical biographies of Jesus. I'm sure the church here would happily give you a copy of one of those, take away, have a read of it, and start asking yourself the question, who does Jesus think he is, and what do I think of that claim?
So one last question, I think, because we're coming really to the end of our time. And I guess it's, and there's a couple of questions really around this, so I guess to sort of summarise it, I guess the questions really are, how do we know that Jesus is real?
Yep.
But more than that, I think, is how is it that Why is it that Christians, why is it the Bible, why does Jesus himself say that he is the only way to God? You know, we've kind of touched on that with the other religions, but why is Jesus real? Why should we listen to him, I guess? But then why then is the only way? Why is he...
Great question.
Why should I kind of take that on board, I suppose?
Brilliant question. Well, I mean, I could be flippant and go, we talked about the resurrection, and if Jesus did rise from the dead, I think guys who rise from the dead have tremendous credibility.
It's worth listening to.
And are worth listening to. But interestingly, you can approach this in two ways. Jesus did indeed say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God except through me. Now, that might sound quite arrogant if you're a visitor or a guest here this evening, until you observe something. No other religion claims to lead you to God. This is a staggering fact that is often missed. No other religion claims to. What do I mean? Well, Buddhism claims if you follow it, it will lead you to kind of oblivion and your consciousness will get absorbed into the cosmic everything, or variations thereof. Hinduism and other Eastern religions will claim to give you a lovely mystical experience and that somehow you'll commune with the oneness of everything. Islam claims to lead you to paradise. But if you read the Quran, God is not present in paradise. Paradise in Islam is a place where there's rivers of wine, crystal clear fountains of water, great meals to eat, and young women for the men to enjoy, more controversially. But God is absent. Only one of the world's major faith traditions says that actually the goal is to have a relationship with God, and if you follow the way, that is where the promise is. And then you suddenly go, gosh, Jesus alone made that promise, and Christianity alone offers out that promise. So if it is God that you are looking for, and you want that connection with the one who made you, there is actually only one offer on the table. It's not Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad, because Buddha and Muhammad did not promise you that. It is Jesus or the highway, quite frankly. Why then should we take him seriously? Well, we mentioned the resurrection. I'd also mention historically, I think the historical evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, not just his resurrection, but the whole of his life, is phenomenally strong. When you look at the Gospels, I mentioned earlier, go and read something like Mark's Gospel. You know, those Gospels, those accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament, they are eyewitness historical biographies written by people who were there at the time of the events, not hundreds of years after. Doesn't mean, sure, just take them at face value just because I say so, but they do have a credibility and authenticity to them, so give them the benefit of the doubt. But then the final reason why we should take Jesus seriously, if the problem we are wrestling with is that our lives are messed up and broken, if we are part of the problem of the chaos in the world and that we need something that deals with that, then I gently put it to you that thousands of years of human history have shown us that the problem is not a lack of education. We're more educated than almost any generation before us. The problem is not economics. Money doesn't seem to solve the world's problems. The problem is not healthcare or politics or any of those things. What we need is something more radical than that. And what I find interesting is this. You see, if our problem had been money, God would have sent us an economist. If our problem had been a lack of knowledge, God would have sent us an educator. If our problem was a lack of technology, God would have sent us a scientist. But if our problem was that we needed a rescuer, then that would tell me why God has sent us a saviour. And that is what is on offer on the person of Jesus. I think what each one of us need is rescue and reconciliation with the God who loves us and extends that offer in Jesus. And he is the only offer on the table. And if that is true, it is the greatest news in the universe. If it isn't true, there is no alternative and all we have is despair. But I think that it is true. I followed him for 30 years. He has not let me down in that time. And for those of you who have not given Jesus a serious look this evening, give it a try, consider it, take a look at the Gospels, come to church a bit more, kick the tires, kick the pastor, and ask annoying questions, and because Jesus is worth knowing.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andy. We'll stop there because we're mindful that we said we were going to go kind of about 9ish, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Andy's going to be around, so don't if you've got questions and we didn't touch on those, or there's other things that kind of cropped up, Andy will be around and kind of loitering with intent, say. Then you can...
And one other very quick thing, talking of questions, Phil, I forgot to mention. On your tables, as well as all the various stuff from the church, which is brilliant, you'll also find this little postcard from Solas, which is where do I go from here. On the back, it says, I have more questions, and there's a QR code. On the Solas website, we have a series now, about 160 videos, short videos, about 4 or 5 minutes, answering almost any conceivable question you could think about Jesus and the Christian faith in a very super accessible way. So if you have a question that hasn't been answered tonight, do the usual QR code thing and then type it. The little box will pop up in your web browser saying, what's your question? Type it in, and there's a very good chance we've got a video addressing it. And or if you're a Christian here this evening, got friends who've got questions, pass that on to them.
Yeah, do take them away. So we've got plenty of them, so do that. Also on your tables, you will see the flyer that's advertised in the conference that's tomorrow. And again, it may be something that you've not really thought about, or it's the first you've heard of it. You'd be very welcome to come. Details are on there. You can book tickets, or you just show up and you can pay on the door, that kind of stuff. But the subjects are on there, the things that not just Andy's going to be speaking on, but the other two speakers as well. So that's well worth coming along to that. Andy will be also speaking on Sunday morning at our 10 o'clock service, and also at our 4:30 service as well. We've got one of those on Sunday, but certainly Sunday morning might be quite good to come and find out more and to check us out and come to church. The other thing is we are going to be running a course coming up in September that is an opportunity for people to come to, where we look at Christianity, we look at some of the gospel accounts, and again an opportunity to ask lots of questions, and that's over a number of weeks. And we'll be advertising that through the church. But if you've been, someone's invited you, they'll let you know about that course, and you can join into that and be part of that as well. And for those of you who are not regulars at CEC, you're not regulars on Sunday, or church members, or part of the church here, we'd love to give you a free book. In fact, 2 free books on the way out. One book is called Guerrilla Christian. And that book, it really is a great book, because what it does is it picks up some of the questions that most people generally ask about the Christian faith, and there are just little kind of short chapters that just sort of answer those questions in a really helpful way. So you can have one of those. And there's another book that we're going to give you called Changing Lanes, and that book really is all about, well, I'm kind of going this direction, and I'm all right about Jesus, but actually, what does a life with Jesus look like? It's this changing lanes, making a change. And that book, again, will help you understand a bit more about why Jesus came, what he did, why it's so important and worth considering. So we'll give you those as a free gift, just as a thank you for coming this evening. If you're regular at CEC, they're not for you. And if you take one, I will charge you when I see you on Sunday. No, but for those of you who are not, we'd love you to take those books and do that. And do have a look at the bookstall. There are loads of books there that might be helpful for you. So thank you so much for coming. Don't rush off. You're welcome just to kind of chill and chat. But thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.